Everest has claimed hundreds of lives, but this death is different. The man died not because the mountain was stronger. He died because those he trusted betrayed him. This is a story of faith, betrayal, and solitude at the edge of the world. Before Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay first set foot on the summit of Everest in 1953, the mountain had been attempted dozens of times. The most famous attempt was the Mallory and Irvine expedition in 1924, but that's a separate story. They were far from the only ones who tried to conquer the highest point on the planet. Some turned back and descended, while others remained on its slopes forever. But Maurice Wilson's ascent defies all categories. This was not a costly expedition with government support, a large team, Sherpas, and official permits. This man had no connection to the world of mountaineering whatsoever. Maurice Wilson was born on April 21, 1898, in Bradford, an industrial town where the air smelled of wool and machine oil. His father owned a textile mill, and his son's future seemed predetermined. Work at the family business, then managing it, then passing it on to the next generation.
A cycle in which thousands of families across England lived, measured, predictable, stifling. Everything changed in 1914, when the First World War began. 18-year-old Wilson, swept up in the patriotic fervor that gripped an entire generation, volunteered for the front. He didn't yet know that he was leaving for good. Not in the sense that he would die. He would survive. But the young man who boarded the train at Bradford Station would never return. At the front, he was to experience everything that war had to offer. Artillery barrages that made the ground heave in waves and left a high-pitched ringing in his ears for days. Gas attacks, yellow-green clouds creeping through the lowlands, making men writhe and clutch their throats, while those who didn't get their masks on in time drowned in their own lungs. Suicidal charges from the trenches at the signal of a whistle, when an officer raises his hand and you know that in a second you'll have to climb over the parapet and run straight at the machine guns. And you run, because everyone is running, because to stop is to let down the men beside you. He went through the Battle of Passchendaele, 3 months in waist-deep mud.
3 months when the rain never stopped, and the trenches turned into gullies of liquid clay where men drowned. Not a metaphor, they literally drowned. A man would slip, fall, and his comrades couldn't pull him out in time. Later he was awarded the Military Cross. The citation was dry, as all military citations are, for holding a position against superior enemy numbers. But to put it in plain language, Wilson was the sole survivor of his entire unit. Everyone else lay around him, but he kept firing the machine gun, because if he stopped, the Germans would get through. And he didn't stop. How long it lasted? An hour? 2? 5? He couldn't remember later. Time flows differently in war. Sometimes a minute stretches into an eternity. Sometimes a whole day collapses into a single flash. A few months later, 2 bullets in his arm. The bone was shattered. A field hospital, the smell of carbolic acid and rotting flesh, screams from the neighboring cots. A surgeon who looks at the X-ray and shakes his head. They saved the arm, but it had lost almost all its mobility. His fingers barely obeyed him, and a dull, aching pain took up permanent residence there.
It would flare up in damp weather, in the cold, sometimes for no reason at all, a reminder. In the trenches, he contracted tuberculosis, a severe case. In those days, that was like a death sentence, deferred for a few years. The doctors threw up their hands. Sanatoriums, mountain air, rest, all of it could slow the disease, but not stop it. Wilson finished the war as a captain, with medals, a mangled arm, holes in his lungs, and what is now called post-traumatic stress disorder. The term didn't exist back then. They called it shell shock, nervous exhaustion, or more often, nothing at all. People would just look at a man who flinched at a slamming door, who couldn't sleep without a light on, who sometimes froze mid-stride in the street with a vacant stare, and they would look away. Like hundreds of thousands of other returning veterans, he couldn't find his place in civilian life. The textile mill? His father expected his son to return and take his place, but Maurice looked at the machines, the workers, the ledgers, and couldn't understand the point of it all. After what he had seen, after what he had done, to sit in an office and count bales of wool?
He physically couldn't bring himself to do it. A period of wandering began. London for a few months, odd jobs, cheap rooms in neighborhoods where it was best not to go out after dark. The United States, an attempt to start over that led nowhere. New Zealand, at least he could breathe there, but that didn't help either. He married several times. He left women just as he left jobs and cities. He would pack his things, if there was anything to pack, and leave, as if he were searching for something, though he himself didn't know what it was. And all this time, he was haunted by the pain in his crippled arm and a cough. Dry at first, then with blood. The tuberculosis was in no hurry, but it never retreated. Every morning, sputum into a handkerchief, a glance at the red streaks, the thought, how much longer do I have? In 1932, something happened that changed everything. Wilson allegedly met a man named Mayfair. Allegedly, because no evidence of Mayfair's existence other than Maurice's own words has survived. No documents, no photographs, no people who could confirm, yes, there was such a man, I saw him too. Perhaps Mayfair existed.
Perhaps he was a hallucination of a mind ravaged by illness and trauma. Or perhaps something in between, some real person whom Wilson's imagination elevated into the figure of a mystical teacher. In any case, this Mayfair, real or imagined, had supposedly healed over 100 sick people, himself included, from ailments that had left conventional medicine helpless, and Wilson decided to try. 35 days, a strict fast, only water, non-stop prayer for hours on end until the words began to sound on their own, separate from his consciousness. It was like meditation, like self-hypnosis, like a controlled madness. A body deprived of food enters a special state. The consciousness alters. What seemed impossible begins to seem attainable, and the man who seemed to be dying of tuberculosis began to recover. The doctors couldn't explain it. Maurice didn't need explanations. For him, it was all clear. He had found a way. Faith, fasting, and prayer, these were the tools that could heal what medicine could not. After this, he began to preach. His teaching was a strange mixture. Christianity, Eastern mysticism, and something entirely his own, born in the fevered mind of a man who had been through the trenches and survived by a miracle. He spoke of the power of the Spirit, that the body obeys the will, that illnesses are trials that can be overcome if one believes strongly enough. Given his mental state, that PTSD hadn't gone away, something new had just been added to it, it's quite likely this was all a product of his imagination. A brain traumatized by war and illness had constructed a system for itself that allowed it to function. And this system demanded faith, unconditional, absolute faith. But the fact remains, he was indeed cured of tuberculosis. This is documented. Doctors who just months before had given him a year or two to live now looked at the x-rays and couldn't understand how it was possible. The cavities in his lungs had healed, the cough stopped, the blood in his sputum disappeared. This caught the attention of the press. First, short articles in local newspapers. War veteran cured of tuberculosis in an unusual way. Interesting, but not a sensation. The sensation began when Wilson made his next announcement. Some higher power,
he told reporters, was commanding him to climb Mount Everest. The reporters exchanged glances. Everest? The highest peak in the world, which no one had yet summited? The mountain that had already claimed dozens of lives? Yes, Wilson confirmed with complete seriousness. Everest. And for this, he needed nothing but prayer and fasting. He would fly there in an airplane and ascend to the summit alone. It's worth remembering the context. In 1932, Everest remained unconquered. It would be another 20 years before the successful ascent by Hillary and Tenzing. The world's best mountaineers, with money, teams, Sherpas, and oxygen apparatus, suffered failure after failure. And here was a man with no mountaineering experience whatsoever declaring he would do it alone. But this didn't stop our hero. He knew absolutely nothing about mountaineering. He had never seen mountains in his life, if you don't count the low hills of the Lake District. Crampons, ice axes, rope techniques, high-altitude acclimatization, all these were just empty words to him. He also knew nothing about aviation, and yet he planned to fly thousands of kilometers through mountains, seas, and deserts.
This, it seems, didn't bother Maurice in the slightest. Faith was a sufficient answer to all questions. Having never sat at the controls of a plane before, he enrolled in a flight school, and, to the astonishment of his instructors, he mastered piloting with remarkable speed. 2 months later, he had his license. His plan no longer seemed so absurd. Mad, yes, but not absurd. For the journalists of that era, Maurice Wilson was a real find, a gift from the gods, a man who seemed to have stepped right out of an adventure novel. Judge for yourself. A decorated combat officer awarded the Military Cross, a wounded veteran who had single-handedly conquered a deadly disease, a preacher of a mysterious teaching that combined Christianity and Eastern mysticism. And mysticism was at the peak of its popularity in those days. Seances, mediums, table-turning, attempts to peek beyond the veil. The war had claimed millions of lives, and millions of families were looking for a way to contact their lost loved ones. Against this backdrop, a man who spoke of the power of the spirit and higher forces seemed interesting, to say the least. And this man, already excellent material for an article in his own right, found himself at the center of two of the hottest topics, mountaineering and aviation. Both fields were experiencing a boom. Mountaineers had by then left the familiar Alps and were turning their sights to the Himalayan giants. Most of the 8,000ers were still unconquered. Each successful ascent became a global sensation. And airplanes had evolved from the fragile plywood contraptions of the Wright brothers era into machines capable of covering 1,000 kilometers without landing. Distance records were being set almost every month. Pilots were heroes, met by crowds, their portraits printed on the front pages. And then a character appears who combines all of this. A veteran, a mystic, a self-taught pilot, a solo mountaineer, a man who says that God told him to conquer Everest, and who, it seems, is actually going to do it. Simply put, Wilson hit the mark. For all his eccentricity, or perhaps because of it, he was the ideal candidate for the role of a folk hero. By May 1933, Wilson had 2 months of training at a London Aero Club under his belt. One accident, on a training flight, a landing in a field, a dented wing, nothing serious. And hiking experience in the Lake District, hills a few hundred meters high that the locals called mountains, but which were mere bumps on the landscape compared to the Himalayas. That was the sum of his experience. 2 months at the controls, strolls through the English hills, an unshakable faith that higher powers would protect him. At that moment, he decided he was ready. He named his airplane, a battered de Havilland Gypsy Moth biplane, Everest. A small 2-seater aircraft with an open cockpit, where the wind hit you in the face and the rain soaked you to the bone. Maximum flight range, about 1,000 kilometers. Cruising speed, just over 100 kilometers per hour. These were the kind of machines flown by mail carriers and thrill seekers.
In such a plane, he was about to cross half a continent. Early one May morning, Maurice climbed into the cockpit, checked his instruments, there weren't many, an altimeter, a compass, a speed indicator, and lifted the plane into the air. London fell away below. Houses, factory smokestacks, the Thames, then green fields, then the English Channel.
Taking into account the terrain, weather, and flight range, the route looked like this: London to Freiburg, Freiburg to Passau, then across the Alps. His first attempt to cross the mountains failed. Clouds obscured the passes, and Wilson, sensibly to his credit, turned around and returned to Freiburg. He was mad, but not suicidal, or rather his madness had its own logic. The second attempt, a different route, further west, and this time it worked. He broke through the clouds, skirted the peaks, nearly scraped the rocks several times. The altimeter showed his clearance was only a few dozen meters, and turbulence threw the plane up and down, but he made it through. Rome. By this point, news of his journey had far outpaced him. The newspapers were already writing about the crazy Englishman flying to Everest in a flimsy biplane, and a crowd was waiting for Wilson at the Rome airfield. Journalists, the curious, mere onlookers. He climbed out of the cockpit, deafened by the engine's roar, his face wind-burned, wearing oil-stained overalls, and found himself the center of attention. This was only the beginning. A few days later, a flight across the Mediterranean Sea, Tunis.
For the first time in his life, Wilson encountered zero visibility conditions. Fog over the water, no landmarks, only his compass and the hope that he hadn't gone off course. One of his contemporaries would later say, any professional pilot in that situation would have turned back. Wilson flew on. How he survived is a mystery. Luck? The higher powers he believed in? Simple statistics? Someone has to be lucky, right? It's unknown. Just a week after leaving London, he reached Cairo. The pyramids, the Nile, heat that melted the asphalt. A few days later, Baghdad. By this point, the newspapers were breathless with excitement. Flights like this bordered on world records, especially for a man who had first taken the controls only a few weeks earlier. He had transformed from an eccentric into a hero. Thousands, no, millions of people were following his journey. Between 1933 and 1934, The Times alone published 151 articles about Everest. About 100 of them were related to Wilson's expedition. Smaller publications were not far behind. Maurice Wilson became a celebrity. According to the plan, his route would continue through Iran to Nepal or Tibet. So far, everything was working out.
Or, as Maurice himself put it, going according to God's plan. The plane was holding up, the weather was cooperating, and there was enough fuel. But there was an obstacle he apparently hadn't considered, or had, but deemed it insignificant. In those years, mountaineering had not yet become a mass sport. For the most part, it was a hobby for the rich and noble, a pastime for those who could afford months away, expensive equipment, and an army of porters. Italian princes scrambled up Dolomite cliffs. English lords, barons, and sirs founded alpine clubs with impenetrable facades of mahogany and leather armchairs. Membership in such a club was inherited or earned through years of waiting. These people, let's call them the mountaineering establishment, had connections, serious connections, with diplomats, with the military, with colonial administration officials, with rulers of nations. They were the ones who organized official expeditions to the 8,000ers. They negotiated with the closed countries of Nepal and Tibet. They obtained climbing permits. They financed the equipment, the porters, the logistics. And these people absolutely did not like the idea that the world's highest peak would be conquered by some upstart, some crazy veteran with no money, no connections, and no understanding of how the world worked. Moreover, and this is important, climbing Everest was a political act, not just a sporting achievement, but a symbol of national power. The British, Americans, and Swiss were all vying for the mountain. China and the Soviet Union were also showing interest. To put it simply,
Whoever reached the summit first was the strongest. That country would gain a reputational bonus, prestige, proof of superiority. And in this great political game, there was no room for random people, especially not people with religious delusions and post-traumatic stress disorder. Previous British expeditions had relied on influential diplomats, on people who knew who to call, whose hand to shake, what gift to give. They had spent years building relationships with Tibetan and Nepali officials. Wilson had none of this. The government of British India and the Air Ministry made it clear to him, no help, neither official nor unofficial.
No permits, no letters of recommendation, not a single phone call in his favor. He was on his own. Wilson felt this lack of support in Baghdad. He submitted a request for permission to fly through Iranian airspace. Denied. No explanation, no possibility of appeal. Simply no. This meant the direct route was closed. He had to find a detour. He turned south, along the Arabian Peninsula. This deviation was not planned. He had no maps of the region. But Maurice, and here his character showed through, simply took out a school atlas, the kind English children used to learn geography. The scale was so large that almost the entire Middle East fit on one page. No details, just general outlines. And he flew. 1,000 kilometers over the desert, scorching sun, hot air that made the plane drop into air pockets, almost no landmarks below. Sand, occasional rocks, sometimes caravan trails. Several times he went off course, realized it from the sun's position, and corrected. His fuel was running low, the needle crept toward the red zone, and by some miracle, that word again, he made it to Bahrain, landing with nearly empty tanks.
Another half hour in the air and he would have crashed somewhere in the sands. They were waiting for him in Bahrain. A local police officer, polite but firm, invited him to the station, formally to check his documents, in reality to inform him, by order of the Royal Air Force, the airspace was closed to civilian flights. He was to return to Baghdad immediately, otherwise he would be arrested. Wilson listened, nodded, and feigned compliance, but he was looking at the wall behind the officer. A map was hanging there, a detailed military map with routes and distances marked, exactly what he had been missing. He memorized it. The coastline, navigation points, the distances between them. He had a good memory. The war had taught him to memorize things quickly and accurately, as his life depended on it. The officer finished his speech. Wilson assured him he would fly to Baghdad immediately. He left the station, got in his plane, took off and headed west, as promised. Half an hour later, he turned east, toward British India. Aviation radar didn't exist then. Communication between airfields was almost non-existent.
By the time the information that he had disobeyed an order reached the right people, by the time they reacted, he would be long gone, or crashed somewhere over the desert, one of the two. He chose to risk it. The flight was theoretically impossible. The distance, significantly more than 1,000 kilometers, the maximum range of his plane. But theory is theory. He was counting on a tailwind, on an economical flight mode, on luck. And somewhere in the middle of the journey, over an endless sea of sand without a single landmark, with nowhere to land, the worn-out engine of the Everest began to sputter. First, it misfired. The engine coughed, lost RPM, then picked up again. Then the misfires became more frequent. It was clear, if he did nothing, it would soon fall silent for good. Wilson landed the plane, right in the desert, on a stony plain, risking breaking the landing gear. He got away with it. He climbed out of the cockpit. The heat, over 40 degrees Celsius. Water, a canteen, maybe enough for a day. Tools, minimal. Knowledge of mechanics, practically zero. But he remembered how the instructor at the Aero Club had shown him how the engine worked. He remembered the general principle.
That would have to be enough. He opened the hood. He inspected the engine.
The fuel line, spark plugs, something with the fuel supply. That much was obvious. He began to disassemble, check, clean. His hands, including the crippled one that barely bent, ached. The metal, scorching hot in the sun, burned his fingers. Sweat poured into his eyes. Several hours, maybe more, he lost track of time. And the engine started. He got into the cockpit, started the engine, heard its steady roar, and laughed. Or cried, or both. Alone in the middle of the desert, with an airplane repaired on the fly, he took to the air again. At sunset that day, he landed in Gwadar. This flight, by a man with no piloting experience, in a plane that shouldn't have been able to make it, with a breakdown en route through territory closed to flights, was, in its significance, quite comparable to an ascent of Everest. And this was still just the journey to the mountain. Maurice became a superstar. Next came several days of easy flights to the last Indian airfield before Nepal. The press praised the miracle man who had covered 7,000 kilometers in 17 days. But the joy was short-lived.
In India, his airplane was confiscated. The colonial authorities, the same ones who had promised not to help, decided they would actively hinder him as well. Without the plane, he could fly no further. Wilson himself was placed under police surveillance, formally not arrested, in reality on the verge of it. Without the plane, the plan was falling apart. The whole idea to fly to the mountain and climb it was now impossible. Half of it was done, the second half was in question, but Wilson was not about to give up. In the middle of the monsoon season, he walked 300 kilometers along washed-out roads to the border of Nepal. The monsoon turned trails into rivers of mud. Bridges were washed away. He had to spend nights in villages where there was nothing but rice porridge and wary glances. But he made it, and he began trying to contact the king of Nepal. In those years, Nepal was literally a closed kingdom. Foreigners were forbidden entry with the rarest of exceptions. Roads barely existed. Domestic politics consisted of clan struggles for influence, intrigues, and coups. The elites had no time for some mountaineer.
They had not yet realized that the mountains were a future gold mine. The tourists and climbers would one day become the country's main source of income. For now, outsiders only annoyed them. The bureaucrats in Kathmandu remained deaf to Wilson's appeals. Permission to enter? Denied. Permission to climb? Not even considered. Maurice changed his plan. If not through Nepal, then through Tibet. Everest stands on the border of two states, and routes to the summit lead from both sides. He sold his confiscated, and later returned under pressure from the press, airplane and set off for Darjeeling, a town on the border with Tibet, the place from which all British expeditions to Everest had started. But Tibet was an even more closed country than Nepal, a theocratic state under the rule of the Dalai Lama, not yet conquered by China or anyone else. Outsiders were not welcome there either. Denied. And this is where any normal person would have stopped. He had no plane. He had no permits. The authorities of both countries through which he could reach the mountain had forbidden him entry. What else could be done? Wilson decided otherwise. He spent the autumn and winter of 1933 to 1934 in Darjeeling, officially as a tourist. He told local officials, "That's it. I've changed my mind. No climbing. I just like it in the mountains. I want to rest." The authorities watched him, but gradually relaxed. Just another crazy Englishman. There were plenty of them around. Let him wander. But Wilson himself was preparing. He trained. He hiked in the mountains around the town, low by Himalayan standards, but mountains nonetheless. He got in shape. He acclimatized. His crippled arm still ached, but he was learning to manage it. He studied the route. He found people who had participated in previous expeditions and asked them for details: where to set up camps, which sections were the most dangerous, how to behave at altitude. He acquired equipment, as much as was possible in his situation: insulated boots, down clothing, a high-altitude tent, modern for its time, with a double layer of fabric.
It had, by the way, been stolen by Sherpas from some British expedition's supply cache. Wilson didn't ask where it came from. He didn't care. And he found porters, 3 Tibetans from Darjeeling willing to accompany him illegally across the border for money. Everything was ready. Early on a March morning in 1934, while it was still dark and the streets were empty, Maurice left Darjeeling, in disguise, a long robe of a Tibetan lama, a shaved head, prayer beads on his wrist. He didn't look much like a European, but in the twilight, if you didn't look too closely. The 3 porters walked beside him. The load was distributed on their backs. They moved north, through Sikkim, a small kingdom between Nepal and Tibet. They hid during the day and traveled at night. They skirted villages. They avoided roads where there might be patrols. 10 days later, they reached the Tibetan border. They were discovered only once. A local lama, a real one, not in disguise, saw the procession, looked closer, and realized the man in monastic robes was a European. Something in his gait gave him away, or the shape of his ears, or just intuition. But the lama said nothing. Maybe he didn't care. Maybe he saw something in Wilson's eyes and decided not to interfere. The border was behind them. In mid-April, the small group reached Rongbuk Monastery. This was a place known to everyone who had ever read about Everest. A Tibetan monastery located right at the foot of the mountain's north face. An altitude of about 5,000 meters, the last outpost of human presence before the zone of eternal ice. The monastery was small, stone buildings buffeted by the wind. Monks in burgundy robes looked at the newcomers without much surprise. They had seen expeditions before. To them, Europeans were strange creatures, obsessed with the desire to climb the sacred mountain. Why, it was impossible to understand, but there was no reason to stop them either. Maurice had reached the mountain. He stood on the grounds in front of the monastery and looked up. Everest blocked out half the sky, a gigantic pyramid reaching into the clouds. A plume of snow was being torn from the summit. Up there, the wind was blowing with such force that it would be impossible to stand. But now, in April, it was the period between winter and the monsoon, the window when an ascent was possible, if it was possible at all. Wilson didn't linger at the monastery. A few days of rest, and then onward. With the persistence of a man possessed, he began to tackle the Rongbuk Glacier. This was the first stage of the route to the summit, a vast river of ice descending from the upper slopes. The glacier was riddled with crevasses, some of them tens of meters deep. Without a rope, without a partner, falling into such a crevasse was certain death. The body would never be found. But Wilson walked on. He often lost his way. The route that experienced climbers memorized on the first try was a labyrinth to him. The ice walls all looked the same. He either didn't notice or mixed up the landmarks, some distinctive rock, some dent in the slope. Several times he reached dead ends, turned back and started over. And yet he climbed. 6,000 meters. An altitude at which most people begin to feel the lack of oxygen, headache, shortness of breath, weakness. Wilson felt all of this, but he continued. 6,500. Here, at this mark, previous expeditions had established their third high-altitude camp. Wilson knew this. He had learned it in Darjeeling. If he could reach this point, it meant a third of the way to the summit was behind him. He reached it. And then, as if the mountain decided to show who was boss, the snow began to fall. Not the light flurries one could wait out under a tree, a real storm. The snow flew horizontally, plastering his face, forcing its way into every crevice. The wind tore at the tent fabric, threatening to carry it away with its contents. Visibility? 0. To take a single step was to risk falling into a crevasse. Wilson was forced to stop. For 2 days and nights he lay in his tent on the glacier, alone, with no connection to the outside world. Outside, the howl of the wind, which never ceased for a minute. The temperature at night dropped to -30, perhaps lower. He lay in his sleeping bag, teeth chattering, and waited. It was there, in that icy hell, in complete solitude, that Maurice Wilson celebrated his 36th birthday. April 21, 1934, the day he had planned to reach the summit. The summit was far away. He was lying at an altitude of 6,500 meters, and more than 2 vertical kilometers still remained to his goal. Kilometers that, at such an altitude, are equivalent to tens of kilometers on the plains. During the night, the storm began to subside. By morning, the wind had weakened enough for him to venture outside. The scene that greeted Wilson was both beautiful and terrifying. A meter-deep layer of snow covered everything. The trail he had broken on the way up, not that it had been clearly visible before, had now completely disappeared. But the main thing was, he was alive, and he needed to go down. 16 hours, that's how long the descent to the monastery took. 16 hours chest-deep in snow, sinking with every step, losing strength. Several times he fell and just lay there for a while, face buried in the white mass, unable to get up. Then he forced himself to stand. When he staggered into Rongbuk, the monks came out to meet him. They had seen the storm. They had not expected him to return. It seemed like that was it. He had tried. He had failed. He could go home. After everything he had accomplished, flying halfway across the world, illegally crossing the border, a solo ascent to 6,500 meters, he was already a hero. Even the mountaineering establishment, which disliked him so much, could not deny it. This man had done the impossible. But Wilson was not going to retreat. A few days in the monastery, rest, hot food, regaining strength. The monks looked after the strange Englishman who spoke of higher powers and a divine mission. To them, this was understandable. They too had their own higher powers and their own missions. Perhaps that's why they treated him with sympathy. And Wilson made a decision. He was changing his plan. The first time he went alone, that was a mistake. Not because he didn't believe in a solo ascent, he still believed. But to reach the point from which one could storm the summit, he needed help. He persuaded 2 of his porters to accompany him to the 3rd camp. Not to the summit, just to the camp. From there, he would go on alone. It was a compromise he was willing to make. The porters, Tsewong and Rinzing, agreed. For money, of course. Wilson paid. He still had some funds left from the sale of the plane, some savings. On the 12th of May, the small group left the monastery. This time, things went better. The weather was favorable, clear skies, a moderate wind. The porters knew the way. They had been here before with British expeditions. The pace was good. They managed to find equipment left behind by previous expeditions. Ropes, tent pegs, some canned goods. Everything had been preserved in the cold. The find was valuable. An additional safety margin. They reached the 3rd camp. Here, at an altitude of about 6,500 meters, the relatively easy section ended and the difficult part began. Ahead lay a steep ice slope leading to the North Col, 7,000 meters. From there, the final push to the summit. The first attempt to reach the North Col ended in failure. The slope was steeper than expected, the ice harder. Wilson had no crampons, those metal spikes that attach to boots and allow one to grip the ice. Without them, every step up became a struggle. He tried to cut steps with his ice axe, but he lacked the technique, and his arm, the one mangled by bullets, did not allow him to strike with the necessary force. They retreated. A few days in the camp, rest, acclimatization,
and a new attempt. On May 29th, Maurice Wilson made a second assault, this time alone, as he had planned from the very beginning. He asked the porters to wait for him at the third camp for 10 days. 10 days, that should be enough to go up and come down. Or not come down. But he tried not to think about that. The porters nodded. They said, "Yes, we will wait." On the morning of May 29th, Maurice Wilson began his ascent. It was the last time he was seen alive.
What happened next can only be reconstructed from circumstantial evidence. The following year, in 1935, another British expedition came to Everest. Among the members were the climber Eric Shipton and Dr. Charles Warren. Not far from the third camp, below the North Col, they made a discovery. A body. An old tent, shredded by the wind. Inside, a skeleton. Dry, frozen skin on the bones. The posture, strange, contorted, as if the man had died while trying to take off his boots. One boot was off. The skeleton's fingers were clutching the lace of the second. Nearby, diaries. It was Maurice Wilson. From the diaries and from the position of the body, it was possible to reconstruct what had happened. He had assaulted the ice wall, alone, without crampons, without a safety rope, with a half-functioning arm. How high he climbed is unknown. He most likely did not reach the North Col at 7,000 meters. The steep ice, fatigue, lack of technique. At some point, he realized he could go no further, and he turned back. He descended to Camp 3 and found no one. The porters he had asked to wait for 10 days were gone. One can imagine what he felt in that moment.
To reach the tent after an exhausting hours-long descent, to pull back the flap and see emptiness. No one. Belongings scattered. Some missing. He had been abandoned. He was exhausted, dehydrated. Perhaps altitude sickness was setting in. At that height, it kills if you don't descend in time. And to descend without help, across the glacier, through crevasses, through meters of snow was nearly impossible in his condition. He crawled into the tent, began to take off his boots. Perhaps his hands were no longer obeying him. Perhaps his consciousness was fading. He took off one boot. On the second, he stopped. Maurice Wilson died alone, from hypothermia, from exhaustion, from altitude sickness, from the betrayal of those he had trusted. Tenzing Norgay, the same man who, 18 years later, would be the first to summit with Hillary, wrote about the discovery in more detail. In 1935, he was a young porter with the British expedition. Here's his testimony. Near Camp 3, below the North Col, we made an interesting but sad discovery. A year earlier, an Englishman, Maurice Wilson, had gone secretly to Everest with only 3 Tibetans, intending to take the summit alone.
He did not return from the mountain. Now we found his body. It lay in an old tattered tent, a dry skeleton with remnants of frozen skin, bent in a strange position, as if Wilson had died while trying to take off his boots. One boot was off, and the skeleton's fingers were clutching the lace of the second. Obviously, he had returned to the tent after an attempt to climb the North Col, found none of his porters, and died of cold or exhaustion. We buried him under the rocks of the moraine near the glacier. Wilson's porters were from Darjeeling. Their names were Tsewang Butya, Rinzing Butya, and Tsering Butya. I later met them there and asked what had happened. They said they had followed the usual route of all expeditions, only they had to avoid patrols and officials because Wilson had no permit to enter Tibet. Having reached the Rungbuk Monastery, they rested there for 15 days, then began to set up camps on the Rungbuk Glacier.
After the third camp, the Tibetans did not want to go any further, and an argument broke out. In the end, Wilson said, "All right, I'll go to the North Col alone. Wait for me here for 3 days." And he went. The porters, according to their words, waited the agreed time and left the camp. Whether they are telling the truth is unknown. One thing was clear: they did nothing to help Wilson. I was indignant. I was ashamed, because they were obligated to either go out in search of him or at the very least wait for his return. Moreover, I saw they had a lot of money, which obviously belonged to Wilson. There is a high probability that the porters never intended to wait. They robbed the camp while he was away on his ascent. They took money, valuables, and descended. Wilson was there illegally. There was no one to complain to. Who would search for a corpse on Everest? And even if they found it, who would prove they were guilty? The perfect crime at an altitude of 6,500 meters. The attitude toward Wilson's attempt to conquer Everest has always been ambiguous. During his life, and especially immediately after his death, the mountaineering community condemned him. A mad amateur who had interfered in a serious affair. An upstart who decided that faith could replace experience. His contemporaries from the climbing clubs deliberately exaggerated his naivety.
They invented incredible biographical details to make him look even more ridiculous. Yes, he was undoubtedly an amateur. Yes, he knew absolutely nothing about mountaineering. Yes, he went to Everest without crampons, without oxygen, without climbing experience. But a completely unprepared man with a broken arm, with lungs that had been eaten away by tuberculosis a few years earlier, managed to climb to an altitude of over 6,500 meters. This is comparable to summiting Peak Pebeti, the highest point of the Tian Shan. Just like that, on sheer enthusiasm, on faith, no matter how strange it was. And his flight from England to India? 7,000 kilometers in a flimsy biplane he had first sat at the controls of 3 months prior, across the Alps, across the Mediterranean Sea, across the Arabian deserts, with a breakdown on the way, which he fixed himself in the middle of a deserted area. This flight, even without considering everything else, was a feat. He wasn't just a madman. He was capable of mastering the most complex skills in the shortest possible time. Piloting in 2 months, enough to make a record-breaking flight.
Mountaineering in a few months in Darjeeling, questioning those who had been to Everest before. Enough to climb higher than most professionals. During his preparation in Darjeeling, he learned a lot from the locals, from the Sherpas who accompanied British expeditions and knew the mountain better than any European. He went on mountain hikes, acclimatized, got into shape. He obtained equipment, what he could. Insulated boots, down clothing, a modern tent. Was he insane? Probably. But no more insane than Mallory and Irvine, who in 1924 also went to their certain deaths and are today called heroes. No more insane than dozens of other climbers who laid down their lives on the slopes of 8,000ers for the sake of, what? Fame? Adrenaline? Some inner need that cannot be explained in words? His image was deliberately distorted for many years, because to acknowledge his achievements was to admit that an ascent of Everest was possible without state support, without huge amounts of money, without an army of porters and tons of equipment. And this undermined the very foundation of the mountaineering establishment, their monopoly on heroism.
Few of the famous climbers of that time acknowledged Wilson. Eric Shipton, the one who found the body and the diaries, was an exception. He told the police in Darjeeling that he was deeply moved by what he had read, by Wilson's convictions, by his careful attitude towards nature. Even in the diaries, written on the verge of death, he did not curse the mountain. By his belief that any difficulties could be overcome by willpower. Decades passed. In 1980, Reinhold Messner made the first ever solo ascent of Everest, without oxygen, without support. When he was at an altitude of about 8,000 meters, exhausted, half blind from the snow glare, on the verge of hallucination, he thought of Wilson. Later, in an interview, he said, "I asked myself, had I equaled him in madness?" This is perhaps the best epitaph. What is this story about? Not about money. Wilson had almost none. Not about fame. He did not seek it, at least not in the usual sense. Not about ambitions of a conqueror. He did not want to plant a flag or get into textbooks. This is the story of a man who was deeply, irreparably traumatized by war. The First World War broke an entire generation.
Millions of young men went to the front and returned different, or did not return at all. Those who survived physically often did not survive mentally. We have fine medical terms for this: PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but the terms do not convey the essence. The essence is that a man went through hell, watched his friends die, killed himself a lot, systematically, because that was the job. And then the war ended, and he was told, "That's it, now go back to a normal life. Get married, work, pay taxes." And he couldn't. The series Peaky Blinders, those who have watched it will understand, shows this well. The guys who returned from the First World War cannot find their place and plunge into violence, into crime, into gangsterism, because only there, in danger, on the edge, do they feel alive. Wilson chose a different path, not violence but unattainable goals. Everest was not a literal mountain for him. It was a way to find peace, or, what is closer to the truth, a way to finally stop searching. He did not reach the summit. There was still a long way to go, about 2 vertical kilometers, but he did find something.
There, in the icebound tent, at an altitude of 6,500 meters, in complete solitude, in the last hours or minutes of his life, perhaps he finally found what he had been chasing all those years. Peace. One wants to believe it is so.